Hello, everyone. Welcome to our workshop today. Today, we will be getting started shortly. We'll give a little bit of time for everybody to come in and join. But today, we're going to be talking a lot about, cannabis and CBD solutions, but more about how do you get them set up? How do you get a bank sponsorship? What's the challenges we have as an industry, as an ecosystem, and kind of get into the weeds of how and what and some of the challenges that our astute panel has had. So I'll give it a couple minutes to allow everybody to come in, and we'll start with introductions and we'll get started. Okay, so. Righty. Okay, so not to have dead space setting here, let's go around our panel and we'll introduce everyone. Let's start with Courtney first. Courtney, she's from Portal 42. Let Courtney introduce herself.
Hey, I'm Courtney. I'm with Portal 42. We are a point of sale for the cannabis industry. We're out of Michigan, so I have firsthand knowledge on what is happening at the dispensary level.
Great. Thanks, Courtney. Mike, Mike is from the PAI, or otherwise Payment Alliance International. Mike, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mike Nelson with Payment Alliance. We are an ATM processor. We're full service from to independent sales organizations. I do work in the product department, and so we have dealt with cannabis over the years as it's evolved into a product for the ATM.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And last and definitely not least, because we all know everybody needs a bank to do anything in payments. So Bill is from, I always want to say PB&J for some reason, but PB&T Bank. Bill, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. Bill Baustein with Pueblo Bank and Trust. We provide bank sponsorship both on the ATM side and the merchant services side. So appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar.
Excellent. Excellent. So for this discussion, I think it's important for our viewers and our attendees to kind of understand a little bit about, the payment ecosystem enough to understand why is cannabis and CBD different? Why is it harder? And it really comes down to, an ecosystem that we all live in and we work in. So, most people know, that there's processors and they know that there's a POS device and they know about ATMs and they know about these things, but they don't quite know whose role is what and who does what, who's responsible for what. And honestly, it changes. It's not always the same because it really depends on the use case. It depends on what you're doing, what industry. And, ultimately, as I said, what we need is a bank. So with Bill, he, as a bank, any bank has to be able to accept a certain amount of risk. And there's different risks with different types of transactions and payments. So, I think our panel we have here today is really a great 360 degrees of what happens in the payments world, and especially around this topic of CBD and cannabis. When we look at this, with Courtney being on the front end, that's the device that has to take it, right? So Mike is on the ATM side. We know there's solutions there. In Beth's session earlier, I think one of the comments actually asked about his solution, just so you know. And then ultimately, you need a processor that would be like us in handling that. But, Mike's also a processor. So see, then sometimes words get confusing. And then Bill, coming from a bank perspective, we all know you got to have a bank. So in the world of payments, nothing moves, no money moves without a bank. So, what's the dynamics here, right? And there's this word that Bill brought up, sponsorship. Some people know what that is, and some people think they know what that is. So Bill, why don't you talk a little bit about what is a bank sponsorship? What do you mean by that? What does that mean to a company that says, if I'm a merchant or if I'm a processor, what does that mean?
Well, in very simple terms, sponsorship gives you access to the various networks to process your payments. Visa and MasterCard require us to register all ISOs that we deal with, any merchant that we deal with directly. In most cases, it's going to be through a processor. In order to ride their rails, they need sponsorship. So we have the ultimate liability associated with those payments. We work very closely with the ISOs and we work very closely with the processors, et cetera. But in order to ride the rails of the various networks, you need to have sponsorship services. And that's what we do. So we do a lot of due diligence up front with any partner that we bring aboard. And we look at their financials, we look at their wherewithal, the ability to process chargebacks, et cetera. We take a look at all that because ultimately, in order to provide sponsorship, we're going to assume that liability. We're going to make sure we understand who we're dealing with.
Okay, great. So let me just ask you a question. When you say sponsorship, you mentioned some networks like I think you said Visa and MasterCard. So does everything in the payment world need a sponsorship? Do I need a sponsorship to do an ACH? If I wanted to work with you in ACH, or if I wanted to do ATM processing like Mike, do I need a sponsorship for that?
Great question, and the answer is yes. On the ACH side, you have to go through a bank because it's a payment mechanism, so you have to have sponsorship. On the ATM side, it's broader than just Visa and MasterCard. It's the various regional debit networks that we have to register our partners into. So the answer is yes to that.
Okay. So those networks, you're referring ATM networks and stuff, you're referring to, they're also, I think, referred to as PIN debits, right? So PIN debit, when you think of, when people say a PIN debit, that's when you're using a PIN in the debit network, kind of, that's what it really means, right? So
yeah, in some examples, the NICEs, the STARS of the world, we have relationships with them. We sponsor those transactions through the ATM. That's another service that Pueblo provides.
Okay. Now, I'm going to pick up something that on our previous discussion before we got started, Courtney had said something that I wanted to ask you about. So when, she's on the front end of that process from a POS standpoint, right? So when it comes from a bank perspective, again, she had mentioned that not all banks can take on as much transactions. Is that true? So do you have a limit of how much you could take on? And is that something that let's say a provider or a processor that wanted to get, or a fintech wanted to get involved, would they need to be conscious of that with working with a bank like yourself?
Well, the way I would answer it, I think there's a risk question and then there's a technology standpoint. We actually don't touch the transaction. That the processor will actually process that. So from a technical standpoint, there's no limitation. On the other side, where the risk comes in, that's why we do the due diligence, is we're going to take a lot different look at a big merchant to make sure they have the wherewithal, and a small merchant who might not have the wherewithal to look at the risk. So that's why we're going to look at their procedures, what processes they have. Processors play a big role because they're doing most of the heavy lifting. So per se, there's not a limit per se, but on the risk side is we might work out arrangements where we're going to require reserves because we're not sure they would have the wherewithal to stand behind a chargeback or return down the road. Okay?
Okay. It's what's interesting and what I heard you say, and I'll say it in a different way, and which I have to applaud as a bank, because banks, you have two kinds of banks, and they're driven by risk management a lot of times. So you have risk avoidance banks and risk mitigating banks. So it's clear, Bill, you guys are a risk mitigator, right? Which is, I'm glad to hear that. Because that's really what it amounts to is, take on more risk than they have to adjust for things. So Mike, as a processor from an ATM standpoint, how do you work with banks and help enable things? Talk a little bit about your solution first and talk about ATM and how it works in the dispensaries, but also talk about your friction that you've run into with the bank and how do you make sure they get what they need at the same time, or processing your business?
Ben's it's a little bit different. PAI is actually not a processor. We're actually a large ISO that is contracted with different processors. Our sponsor bank, although, and to Bill's point, takes care of our risk and our underwriting from that standpoint and gets us into the debit networks, into the rails of Visa and MasterCard. One of the things that Bill didn't really talk about that I think is grossly misunderstood is all the reporting that the sponsor bank actually does back to the network on your transactional data, both daily and monthly. If we as an ISO had to handle, or even at the processor level, handle all that data and getting it to the networks as it's required, it would take an enormous amount of time. So the sponsor bank does handle all of the data points of getting back to those networks as well. And so for us, cannabis has been around in the ATM business for a long time, and for years, market partners and independent sales guys would load cannabis into locations under alias names, and they would stay open for 3 or 4 months until most recently the rampage of checking and doing physical site surveys has seemed to have been on the rise because of cannabis. And so we've had a lot of locations that are shut down, and what happened was they were immediately reopened, another name, another alias, a different animal. From a banking standpoint, on the ATM side, the funds are settled to a sales agent's account, which hasn't been a problem for the bank to accept those deposits coming in. And so for our situation, Meta is our sponsor bank. They're just handling the recording and the due diligence and the underwriting of the account, but the actual money movement is been to the individual ATM owner or processor account for the funds, and that has not been an issue. Recently, Meta came to the table with, they are underwriting cannabis locations for us, and we have entered into a third-party agreement that will be for about 120 days. We do have to do some additional reporting. We also have some stipulations, and one of the things that is very foremost is the cannabis location cannot own the ATM and cannot be the source of funds for the ATM. So they can't take cash coming into the cannabis location and drop it in the ATM. And so it's purely a situation where an independent sales guy is going to go in and place an ATM in a location of business, and he is going to vault that cash and take care of that service with him or his company. We are prohibited to using bailment funds in cannabis. So obviously your cash couriers are going to be out of that situation, and they're not going to put their cash at risk in those cannabis locations today. It does require enrollment from our side. One of the agreements, because of the due diligence and the reporting that we provide to Meta monthly, as Bill also has in his agreement, there is reporting that needs to get done. We need to identify all the cannabis locations across the country in a positive way so that we can provide the proper reporting on a monthly basis to Meta, who is actually underwriting those cannabis locations.
Sorry, I was on mute. What you just described was, I believe that you have established a TPP agreement with Meta. Was that what the third party agreement part?
That is correct. It's actually an addendum to our original sponsorship agreement, and it revolves around the cannabis and CBD oils, and it's really some additional rules and reporting in that addendum. We do ask our partners and independent contractors to sign that addendum that we have out there that says, hey, you're going to operate under the state rules, because every state has a little bit of different regulations, that you're not going to allow the cannabis location itself to be the source of funds or own the ATM. And so those are, and the other, it doesn't really impact us, but we can't take deposits at an ATM in cannabis. And that's not something that we do in the retail world today, but that was one of the stipulations, is you couldn't have a bank ATM that was deposit capable in a cannabis location, which we wouldn't do from a retail aspect anyway.
That's interesting. Just for the audience and for the attendees, I want to paint a picture for you a minute, and it has a lot to do with who we have on the call too. Remember something in the industry, there's kind of a stack, kind of like a technology stack, if you will. At the top, you typically have the bank, right? And I kind of put the networks behind it because the bank is the endpoint for the network. But in the front end of acquiring, you have the bank first. You'll typically see a processor next. You'll see an ISO next. and each of these are working with the or above one. And then an ISV or a device like a POS device is normally at the end. That's the end point of the process where the consumer starts. Now, I want to point something out. We just mentioned a TPP agreement, third-party processing agreement. So that allows that ISO that is technically not the bank processor to act as the processor for a specific type of thing. They use it a lot in ACH, and they have for years. So TPPs have really come about in ACH processing, but now because of real-time payments, RTP, and all these other converging things like prepaid cards becoming banks and things like that, the rules are changing, but the compliance structure is still the same, and you just need to be aware of those, and it helps you navigate the roads and how to know how to put your plan together, right? So I just want to call that out because a third-party processing agreement is another item that you're audited against also, and it also drives a lot of the bank compliance rules down to you as an entity, hence why Mike had more work to go do, right, and report it. So with that ecosystem and that stack in place, let's talk to Courtney a little bit. And Courtney, talk to us about, placement of these devices in dispensaries and places where we could do that. And what have you found challenging at Portal 42 to be able to implement your services with merchants?
Well, every dispensary I've been in, they all have their ATMs. And when it comes to implementing payment processing, when it comes to the equipment, some of these locations spend millions of dollars making their location look like a very modern, Apple Store type of facility. And so when it comes to equipment, they want equipment, like minimal equipment, if any, and they want it to look good. They don't want, big bulky things sitting next to their really expensive registers that look very modern and tablets. So when it comes to that, and then when it comes to, I've had a lot of my business owners, clients come to me and they're concerned about such a high percentage. Now, in cannabis, they're already paying percentage for this and a percentage of that. And so when it comes to, and they understand it's risk that's involved in processing cannabis, but they are concerned with some of the high percentages that come in there, like 4.5% for running a card process. And then they also come and ask me about, chargebacks. And so what happens with the chargeback, who's charged, do they lose out on that? And so there's still, especially here in Michigan, where we just went rec, and we're still kind of learning the process of, going through, and business owners are still coming on board and getting bank accounts, and they're still going through this very slow process. They're still hesitant to start taking credit cards because of the risk that's involved. That's probably the biggest concern.
When you say risk, what do you mean by risk in the merchant's eyes? What do they see as risk versus a bank sees it differently, right? So what does a merchant see? So
the risk involved for them is, with cash, they know exactly what they're doing with it. They, with this though, they're like, well, what if the merchant gets shut down? What happens to my money? Where does it go? Does it get held? Am I going to get it back? What happens in that process? That's where they see it, because when they're dealing with cash, which is what they've been dealing with for all these years, they take the cash, they go to the bank. It's there if they have a bank account. And so for the processing of the credit card, because it's new and because it's just still scary to them, to be honest, they still feel like their money could get locked up somewhere in the process, like being held by a processor who maybe had some chargebacks.
Is it legal in Michigan?
Yes.
It's fully legal. So is it in comparison to Colorado?
Yes.
Because I know some have levels, like California has a certain amount and things like that you can have on you versus at the dispensary, and different rules, right, per state. I mean, that's some of the challenges for any national bank, right, too.
Right. So it is
Okay.
fully legal in Michigan. It's recreational, it's medical. And there's, like I said earlier, there's only a handful of banks in the state of Michigan that even work with cannabis businesses. And so some of these businesses are still going through the process of even getting bank accounts. And to process payments, to even take credit cards, you have to have a bank account. So places that have been open for years and are completely licensed are still going through that process.
Got it. Now, Bill, let's go back to you. Something with Courtney that brought up. She talks about local banks, right? And why don't you talk a little bit about state versus national charters and the complexities associated with that? I mean, most people know this, but let's just kind of repeat it for that sake, because I think it depends on the state where you're at, and it depends on what kind of charter you're in and what kind of bank you're working with. Talk to us a little bit about that. What should you know if you're getting into this industry? And if we wanted to do something with a bank or what should we know?
Well, point of clarification, we do not support cannabis. We do support CBD on the merchant services side. When at ATMs, we do support cannabis, very similar to the guidelines that Mike talked about. I'll be honest with you, I'm not really familiar with the differences on the state and federal level. I will tell you, like on the CBD side, one of the requirements we have is where it's not legal, if you're selling it over the internet, what measures do you have in place to remove that particular transaction? But to be honest with you, Travis, I'm not real versed on the state versus federal. I do know that we have to report to our respective regulators, and they have to sign off on any venture that we'll get involved in.
But okay, so and maybe I made it too broad, but you're a state chartered bank today, right?
Correct.
For Colorado, right? So,
yes.
So most of us know that there's this disparity between the state laws and the national laws, right? So, if you're in the earlier sessions, you heard Glenn Book talk about that, Beth talk about it there, because it's not legal nationally. It's only at a state level, and so there's that organization she had mentioned also. It's FinTech, and they're kind of the we'll call it the financial world police, and you don't have to make them mad. And they so you have to register with them regardless, and then you at a state level you have to get a license that you're doing business in. So when a bank is trying to offer support, they can only support where they're chartered, or they'll run into this national problem about it being illegal nationally as a global item, but in the state it's not. So they have to stay within the border. So an example, Bill, if somebody came into you from Vegas and says, hey, I want to set up shop, I'm going to be running it on the internet and selling it in Vegas, can you do business with them?
If it's on the CBD side, yes. We do not do cannabis sponsorship. So on the CBD side, yes. And the same is true on the marijuana side, on the ATM side. So to answer your question, yes, we do. Okay, good.
I mean, and this is the things that I think is somewhat confusing sometimes for people when they're working with banks and kind of get, even at a merchant level, a merchant account set up, or it's a processing level, because it's not always clear. Well, if it's not illegal there, but we're legal here, so what creates the legal entity? Is that presence in that state from an underwriting standpoint? So talk to us a little bit about BSA and AML, we'll call it, the onboarding process. So a new customer, brand new person walks in your bank and says, I am a CBD e-commerce merchant. What do you do with them? Walk us through a little bit about that BSA process, that onboarding process, and that just make it brief, but we do have a little bit of time issue here. We're going to run out in about 5 minutes, but kind of give an idea of what everybody has to go through. And this is regardless, no matter if you're coming through a processor or an ISO or anybody else, that merchant's going to get treated the same.
Okay, it's real easy with us. We don't underwrite the individual merchant. We'll underwrite the ISO. So we're going to want to see what their policies and procedures are on underwriting. Do they do the credit checks, those type things. So, and when we go audit them, we're going to want to pull out the documentation to prove that they're doing what they said. So in essence, from our standpoint, is we underwrite the ISO, not the individual merchant, but we want to make sure we understand which due diligence they're doing on that particular for their underwriting.
Very good. Thank you, Bill. So if you guys remember, I talked about this little stack, right? Notice the bank is here, the processor here, and the ISO. So and with a third-party agreement, the bank has that direct relationship with the ISO too. That's where all that banking underwriting happens. And what we have to carry through to the merchant. So Mike, do you want to continue with that a little bit, what you have to go through to bring on and onboard a merchant?
Yeah, and so we do things similar. We underwrite the ISO, but I think going back to your question about the federal versus the state level, from a bank that's going to take a dispensary on as a banking client, I think the problem that we all have to remember is that in the credit card world, as well as the ATM world, the charter of Visa and MasterCard and Discovers and the networks are chartered at a federal level, and they're governed at a federal level. And so whether a state thinks cannabis is okay, that's okay with the state, but the bank needs to be chartered in that state and adhere to the state rules, where you get a Bank of America or a Wells Fargo or these larger banks that operate amongst several state lines. They're not going to be apt to take on a dispensary because they're being governed at a federal level and not a state level, where your local credit union that's chartered in a state that might have cannabis as being legal, you probably have a much better chance of opening a bank account there and getting in because they're regulated by the state, but the transaction is still governed at a federal level. And that's been the ongoing struggle that we have, is who has authority? Is it the state or is it the federal government? And I think the lines are clear. The state has authority in its jurisdiction, but the cardholder or the cards being issued by Visa and MasterCard are absolutely governed at a federal level. And until the federal government is going to relax some of those rules, it's going to be an ongoing war between the federal government and the state government at a banking level.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. This is exactly why we have the solutions in the market of ATMs, prepaid card, closed loops, because they kind of loop the networks that are regulated or that are forced to be regulated like that. So we are, just about out of time. So I do want to give everybody a chance to make comments. Courtney, Mike, Bill, is there anything you'd like to end with? For any questions you guys have, we will scoop those up and get you some answers back to you after the session, but we'll definitely respond. So please post the questions, and Charlotte will help us get answers back. So I'll start with the panel. Courtney, you head off, and give us your ending thoughts here.
Well, so anybody who is interested in bringing payments to dispensaries and having processes, the best thing for me, I guess I would say, to do is to make sure that everything in your process is completely transparent, so that they have a really good understanding of what happens with the process. Because like I said before, they're nervous about taking credit cards. They really want to, but some of them can be nervous about taking credit cards. And making sure that it's completely transparent and above board, and that they feel like their money is going to be safe. That's where it really, and keeping, I know it's risk involved, but keeping rates low, because they have so many fees that they pay, and now on top of it, to take cards, they can just use the ATM, in the front and deal with their cash. And they understand that it's a great opportunity, but just making sure that everything is above board and that your client feels safe and confident.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. Mike?
So as an ISO, it seems like there's dispensaries popping up everywhere, and we all want to get in there and we all want to play because there is good money and there's good revenue. The one thing I would caution about is that, a lot of even our program today, and I think Bill, to your point too, is that these are things that the sponsor banks are now starting to entertain. They're loosening up a little bit and they're wanting this business, but by no means do we put all our eggs in the cannabis basket and go down that road, because we just don't know where this is going to go. There's a little crack right now and we're wiggling in as best we can. I would encourage you to understand the rules of your processor, the rules of your sponsor bank, because the last thing you want to do is get into a location, spend some money to get an ATM in there or a credit card system, and then get that call that, hey, we're shutting you down, and then you're scrambling to find something that will work. And so I just caution you on that. Understand what you're doing, understand what your processor's rules, and understand your sponsor bank rules.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Bill?
I'll be real
Give
short
us
on
your
this.
wisdom.
I'll be real short. I'm going to echo with both what Courtney and Mike said. From a bank's perspective, we're very interested and we're going to review. We want to understand what measures are being taken to make sure you're within compliance with the network rules and the state and local laws. So from a bank standpoint is when you present something to them, that's where they're going to come from, is what measures you've got in place to be compliant.
Compliance, compliance, compliance. As a processor, I totally agree. You need to live and die by your compliance. And if we're going to live in a world that's choppy like this, you have to. So I will shamelessly plug real-time payments, as RTP will be a rail that will help and help us get away from some of this national scrutiny around the bigger networks. So with that, we will end this session. Thank you everyone for joining. Please add your comments and we'll respond accordingly. So thanks again, and you guys have a wonderful day.